My name's Paul Hoggett. I helped set up the Climate Psychology Alliance, which was born and developed in Bristol, actually, back in 2012. My background, I've been an academic in both Bristol's universities. And then as I kind of reached the end of my academic life, I trained as a psychotherapist, and I worked as a psychotherapist for about 10, 12 years, and I've just retired this summer from doing that work. So what I'm probably going to focus on primarily today is the political dimension of things, rather than bringing the psychological dimension in. But I will just start off with a saying that some of you will be familiar with. It comes from James Baldwin, the black writer. And if I can remember it properly, he says, not everything that can be faced can be changed. Yeah? But until we face something, we can never change it. And I think that's very important, because the strap line of the Climate Psychology Alliance, which we adhered to ever since the beginning of the Alliance, has been facing difficult truths. Yeah? And we feel that's absolutely fundamental in terms of people being able to garner and gather the courage and strength to not just get themselves through, but get themselves through in a bold and active way in these very troubling times that we're facing and have been facing for well over a decade now. So I needn't say to you anything about the climatic situation out there, the external climate. You're all aware that we're on what Bill McKibben calls the long descent. The direction of travel is downwards at the present moment in time, and the issue facing us is to fight as hard as we can to stop that lift from going too far down towards what he calls the escalator to hell. Yeah. So it's a kind of key challenge that we're facing. Only recently, obviously, in Europe, we've had things like the floods in Valencia, dramatic kind of illustration of the climate chaos which is already gathering around the world. But, think about the global south in the context of all of this. Because some peoples in this world, and nearly all of them in the global south, and mostly therefore non-white, now actually face what the great British historian E.P. Thompson many decades ago called exterminism. Yeah? The extinction of multitudes is what is being faced. Just as an example, who remembers, we're talking about Valencia, who remembers Derna? Derna? September 2023, just over a year ago. Exactly the same as what happened in Valencia. Flash floods in Derna city in northern Libya. The dam bust. 11,200 people died in that flood. And yet we've almost forgotten about it because it's the global south. It's not the global north. Our memory in that sense very often doesn't stretch beyond the borders of the Mediterranean. And that's one of the issues I want to talk about, really, in terms of trying to understand the rise of the far right, because very much, I think, what we're facing in Europe and North America with the rise of the far right is something about the creation of both a psychological and physical border to keep the others out. And I want to suggest that our equanimity about the catastrophe facing the global south may draw upon some of the same racist logic which has enabled us to live with previous genocides, some in our own backyard. For example, almost exactly 30 years ago, I was setting out from Bristol to a multicultural city in Bosnia called Tuzla. This is after the Srebrenica massacre. I went on behalf of what was at that time called the Bristol Forum for Bosnia, an initiative we'd got together to try and do something in the face of this other genocide taking place in our midst. A place where I used to go on holiday. Yeah. Genocide actually occurring. Over 100,000 deaths eventually, according to the United Nations in Bosnia. And crucially, the Serbs, the main perpetrators of the slaughter, imagined themselves to be defenders of Christian civilization in the face of the Muslim menace. Okay? Even then, think of what's happening in Gaza now, even then, the rise of Islamophobia in Europe was becoming increasingly apparent. Just a few weeks after Derna last year, September last year, Hamas broke out of the open prison, that is Gaza, killing over 1,200 mostly Israeli Jews. And the violent suppression of the Palestinian population by the IDF then ensued. And as we know, there have been now over 43,000 recorded deaths in Gaza alone, and an unknown number of people who are unaccounted for. Some of Netanyahu's staunchest allies have been authoritarian leaders, such as Donald Trump during his first term and Viktor Orban in Hungary. And across large parts of the global north, right-wing nationalist parties are gaining power. None see the climate crisis as a priority. Several, like the USA, are pledged to roll back or abandon their existing climate commitments. So throughout Europe and North America, these new authoritarian forces are pushing forward on two main flanks: opposition to migrants and migration, and opposition to environmental legislation and climate commitments. Perhaps the connection between these two things is not immediately clear. So, this is how it goes. Take what was probably the first major indication of this malign coming together, the civil conflict in Darfur that began in 2003. In his speech to the United Nations in 2007, the then General Secretary, Ban Ki-moon, described the way in which the two phenomena, mass migration and genocide and ecocide, were linked. How the rise in sea temperatures in the Indian Ocean led to the weakening of the seasonal monsoon and the drying out of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. Ban Ki-moon went on, and I quote him now, "It is no accident that the violence in Darfur erupted during the drought. Until then, Arab nomadic herders had lived amicably with the settled black farmers who would welcome herders as they crisscrossed the land, grazing their camels and sharing wells. But once the rain stopped, farmers fenced their land for fear it would be ruined by passing herds. For the first time in memory, there was no longer enough food and water for all. Fighting broke out, and by 2003, it evolved into the fully fledged tragedy we witness today. Over 200,000, mostly black African farmers and their families, died at the hands of the Janjaweed militias in the first phase of the conflict. A second and even more potentially destructive phase began last year, the same Janjaweed constituting the core of the Rapid Support Force. These and other stories linking the climate crisis and social breakdown and mass migration have been logged by the Climate and Migration Coalition. And if you want to investigate them, just look them up on the website. They're based in Oxford. And there's lots of examples that they give of the link between social breakdown, climate breakdown, and mass migration. Now, we tend to think of climate change in terms of its sudden and obvious impacts, forest fires, floods, and typhoons, but drought and unendurable heat have more insidious and devastating effects. Drought, in particular, is a major contributor to the more systemic impacts which generate famine, civil conflict, and state failure. Impacts increasingly discernible in parts of Africa and Central America. As in Darfur, ecosystem collapse triggers social collapse. So as the climate crisis deepens, the collapse of ecosystems has a growing impact on human mortality, particularly for indigenous and pastoral societies. In this way, ecocide brings genocide in its wake. Just something about then the genocidal impulse. We know from studies of Nazism and the Holocaust that for genocide to occur, a particular relationship must exist between the victim, the bystander, and the perpetrator, such that the victim can be exterminated with impunity so long as they are seen as non-human and therefore superfluous. I use the word superfluous because it's the word that Hannah Arendt used in a magnificent book on totalitarianism, written after the Holocaust in the 1950s. We often speak in terms of othering in such instances, but the genocidal impulse involves a very specific and virulent form of othering, in which the other is not just seen as different, nor even different and inferior, as, say, British chauvinists might think of the French, but so different they're not even human. Perhaps it's the case that as soon as someone becomes construed as non-human, then they are in some sort of way cast out from the we who qualify as human. Of course, what we're speaking of here is racism. Confronted by what they construe to be inhuman, racists feel free to enact their inhumanity. Whether in the plantations of the Caribbean in the 18th century, the concentration camps of Poland in the 1940s, or the rape camps of Bosnia in the early 1990s, genocide occurs because of racism. And if there's one thing that should now be clear, racism is actually something we're all capable of. And there's a connection in my mind to the furore surrounding British MP Diane Abbott's mistaken view of anti-Semitism made a year or so ago. She argued that whilst anti-Semitism was an expression of prejudice, it was not racism, because racism was inextricably tied up with whiteness and white supremacy. In recognizing her mistake, she potentially provided us all with a lesson and an opportunity to deepen our understanding of racism and the way in which it always accompanies processes of dehumanization. Anti-Semitism is white on white racism. The Rwandan genocide was fueled by Hutu racism, black on black. Japanese and Chinese racism is well documented. Hindu supremacism is showing its ugly face right now. It seems we're all capable of racism, even those like Israeli Jews, whose families have been subject to its vilest forms in the recent past. None of us are moral exceptions. I want to say something about, because I just want to talk a little bit about the phenomenon of Zionism and the tragedy of it. The state of Israel was partly founded upon a myth, a myth central to the Zionist project as it began to develop in the 19th century. And it's vital to understand that the Zionist project was at first primarily a Christian rather than a Jewish one. It was nurtured in early Victorian Britain by figures such as Alexander Keith and Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. It was part of a Christian eschatology. And eschatology is like a theory of the end times. It was part of a Christian eschatology in which the return of the Jews to Palestine signified the imminence of the second coming. The myth was that the area now occupied by the state of Israel was at that time a land without a people, and therefore was a suitable home for a people without a land of their own, i.e. the Jews. Thus the phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land. A very important phrase in the history of Zionism in the 20th century. The idea of Zionism was nurtured by British Christians decades before being adopted by sections of the Jewish community itself. And of course, nowadays, this kind of pre-millennial Christianity has all but disappeared in the UK. We've got a few evangelists who still practice it, but by and large, it's disappeared. But in other parts of the world, particularly in the USA, it has become enormously powerful. In the wake of the sexual liberation of the 1960s, Christian revivalism began to gather pace in the United States, focused on restoring the morals of the nation. It added a spiritual dimension to Ronald Reagan's 1980 election slogan, "Make America Great Again." Trump wasn't the inventor of that slogan, it was Reagan who started it off. Today, Christian Zionism is not only a key element of the religious right in the USA, but it's become a global movement. It's particularly strong in countries such as Brazil, Nigeria, and South Korea. This movement identifies strongly with Israel, seeing the state's formation as the fulfillment of religious prophecy, one which speaks in terms of a coming Armageddon and the return of Christ. Clearly, the Christian Zionist movement is locked in an identification with an imaginary object. The Jews of Israel, not to mention the Palestinians, have become ciphers for a Christian eschatology. Now, the idea that Palestine was a land without a people was, of course, a myth. We need to remind ourselves that in 1922, in the first census carried out under the British mandate, the population of Palestine was 763,550, of which 89% were Arab and 11% were Jews. It has become common for supporters of Palestine to brand Israel as a settler colonial state, just as South Africa was before the ending of apartheid. But my own opinion is that this obscures an important difference. British and Dutch settlers in South Africa were willing agents of imperial power, creating outposts of empire across the globe. The first great wave of Jewish migrants, far from being imperial stormtroopers, had fled Germany to Palestine during the decade that Hitler came to power. But in 1935, the world Zionist movement split, and the militant nationalist wing rapidly grew, particularly in Poland. It supported political terrorism to achieve its aims and formed the core of Ergun and the Stern Gang, who in 1944 initiated the revolt against British government in Palestine. It was this nationalist and ethnocentric Zionism, one later exemplified by the right-wing Likud party, which eventually came to dominate Israeli politics. It knew that far from being a land without a people, Israel was being built upon a land of displaced and resentful people. the Palestinians. Only military force could secure this Jewish homeland. Lasting peace would only be achieved after the utter and total defeat of the Arab opposition. This is realism, albeit a cold, ugly, and brutal realism. The tragedy is that for a century, Palestinian Arabs have been subjected to displacement, expulsion, and repression by another people, the Jews, who had themselves been subject to centuries of persecution and attempted extermination. Michael Segeloff put it this in The Observer a couple of months ago. Despite the fact that Britain's promising of a land to the Jews not theirs to give away stinks of imperialism, early Jewish settlers were far from their imperial soldiers, but a persecuted population failed by global governments pre- and post-Holocaust. So there's no neat separation between victim and persecutor. These two states of mind exist in all of us, as does the bystander. The comforting distinctions between good and bad, right and wrong, that we make have all collapsed under the rubble of Gaza. And when the persecuted have become persecutors, we're in the territory of the deepest tragedy. Tragedy arises not when evil triumphs over good, but when two goods clash and destroy each other. Not when destructive acts occur which take generations to repair, but when destruction occurs which is irreparable. There's a terrible symmetry of suffering in such situations, but perpetrators nevertheless remain perpetrators. Abused children may grow up to be abusive adults, and whilst we may understand the reasons for their destructiveness, to understand is not to condone. So, I want to say something about what's called the armed lifeboat, a phrase some of you may be familiar with. The great movement of climate refugees has already begun as ecological disasters trigger social conflict and collapse across parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Central America. We can see the political reaction to this in the lurch to the right across Europe. These Muslims and Africans are not like us. We must keep them out. As the climate crisis deepens, the demand to control borders and keep out refugees becomes part of a wider push for national self-sufficiency, particularly regarding food and energy supplies. And this has been called the politics of the armed lifeboat. The ship of Western civilization has hit an iceberg, a climate and ecological crisis, and is in danger of sinking. As it begins to list heavily, passengers and lifeboats are flung into the icy water. Those who are drowning struggle to climb aboard the already full lifeboats, but are beaten off on board by those who fear their boat will sink if any more scramble on. So you can see the metaphor of the armed lifeboat. The politics of the armed lifeboat is a perfectly realistic and all too probable strategy for managed social collapse, where, at least for a while, the social fabric of some societies, mostly in the global north, is maintained whilst others disintegrate under the escalating pressures of heat, drought, famine, and war. Seen from this perspective, the new breed of nativist political leaders, the Trumps, Putins, Orbans, Le Pens, and so on, are the would-be commanders of the Titanic's lifeboats. But these are lifeboats which are armed to the teeth and busily kicking away the drowning survivors of the catastrophe. In Europe, the politics of those adopting the armed lifeboat have begun to develop their own ideology, which is called identitarianism. I don't know whether any of you have heard about it. Identitarianism. It focuses on peoples rather than races. So this is the key ideology underlying the emergence of much of the far right in Europe at the present moment in time. It focuses on peoples rather than races. And they insist that the mixing of different peoples, as in multiculturalism, is both practically futile and ethically undesirable. Some of you might remember that at a gathering of some of the far-right members of the Alternative for Deutschland in Potsdam in November 2023, a new euphemism, remigration, was introduced to describe the need for the mass deportation of non-ethnic Germans. In Austria, the far-right Freedom Party, founded by ex-Nazis, has just become the largest party in the Austrian parliament. It is pledged to target what it calls remigration policies at Austria's 700,000 strong Muslim community. Disingenuously promoting both the equality and incommensurability of different peoples, identitarians support the idea that a people should have its own living space. It's just that this living space should not be in Europe. For the identitarians, the state of Israel is a perfect solution to what they, following several generations of fascists, think of as the Jewish problem. At first, it might seem puzzling that the deeply anti-Semitic far right that embraced Holocaust denial now holds Israel close to its bosom in what appears to be a protective embrace. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have been replaced by Islamophobic conspiracies, such as the Great Replacement, which envisages a Europe where white Christians have become numerically eclipsed by non-white Muslims. We're probably all aware of this conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement. That now is a very powerful element of far-right ideology in many European countries, and interestingly enough, in North America as well. Remember Trump's ban on Muslim flights, people into North America. I'm going to pause in a stop in a minute, but just to bring things up to date, unfortunately, something happened last week in North America, which I think relates to some of the things that I'm talking about now. The election of Trump for a second term will obviously have profound consequences, both for climate change, for migration, and for Palestine. And in particular, I think some of you have probably read up a little bit about this thing called the Project 2025, this 900-word document that is the kind of detailed program that Trump may or may not follow, though a number of people seem to think he will be following it fairly closely. Project 2025 is the child of the Heritage Foundation, another of these think tanks, which first started in the early 1970s. Its current director is Kevin Roberts, a name you'll become familiar with in the next few years. And two of the three founders of the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich and Edwin Filner, all three of them are ardent Catholics. I think that's important to understand. So this is where we can begin to see the kind of religious right beginning to exert its influence within Trumpian politics. Key thing to remember about populism is that it looks backwards. That's the key thing about populism. Yeah? And in that sense, it's different to totalitarian movements like fascism and communism, which look forwards. They are utopian movements. Populism looks backwards to some golden age, make America great again, some golden age of some imagined past. And one of the key phrases that the populist right in both North America and Europe now uses, you've probably heard of this, God, nation, family. God, nation, family. Yeah? So bringing together both that moral and spiritual dimension of the Christian right.